My talk is getting to sub-signatures. I kind of feel like the previous 2 days have been an excellent introduction to the subject. So the keynote yesterday, or is it a keynote? I don't know. Talking about Perl being Detroit and the dead end, and one of the big things was how we don't have sub-signatures. So I respectfully disagree. It's not a dead end. We can get new things into core. Not that it's in core yet, but that's actually what this is about. Not so much the technicals of getting it in core, but negotiating through the processes. Figuring out how to get into the core, what needs to be changed, and what things to watch out for. So, thanks for coming. Thanks for coming to my talk. Thanks for coming to YAPC. It's great to see all of you, to meet you, to put some faces to names that I see on the list. I'm one of those few people that read all of P5P, which helps for something like this. So, sub-signatures. We all have a good introduction of what those are right now. My goal is really just to get minimal sub-signatures into core. So, for those of you who have used Moose, Mouse, I don't know all the different ones, you've seen a lot of different features in the sub-signatures, but I don't want to get too fancy. Yeah, one step at a time. So, this is what we have now. Most everything I work on starts like this. Sub-foo, my bar baz equals add underscore. No signature. Some people treat this as a signature. They really shouldn't. Sub-foo $, my bar baz equals add underscore. It's a prototype instead of a signature, and I will get back to that later. And this is really all that I want to get to. Just declaring named variables. No types, no attributes, none of that fancy stuff. Just something to start with. So we can't do this in core yet because we don't allow named arguments. So I keep saying minimal signature. What do I mean by minimal signature? Default arguments. This is a real simple one. This one shouldn't have much argument, but I don't want any argument on signatures, so I've kind of punted on this. $bar equals $baz. That's why I punted on it, because something like this gets to be a little more complicated, and you can end up in bike shedding discussions of what this should mean and when it should mean it. You could have attributes, maybe, somewhat, I don't know, or traits. I think that's the right term from Perl 6, if you wanted to declare it as read-only. Spelling is the absolute last thing I want to discuss right now. So that's exactly why it's not minimal signature and not part of my goal. And this one. Good, I love that I hear laughs. I tested this out on one of the modules that's on CPen, and it's not a fault of the module, it's part of the core toolchain that it uses. This is a tricky parse. You have to really be aware that you're going to hit this before you, and test for it. Make sure that you don't hit it. So, stepping out of the Perl sandbox for a bit, which we've covered. So, function definitions for other languages. I don't need to make these big, we all know. Everything else has it. And for some close relatives of Perl, like awk, which we inherited from, they had it. Perl 6, they have it. And I don't know any more about Perl 6 signatures than this, so I wasn't going to touch it. All right, the first question that I had when I started working on this was kind of, why don't we have it already? And that's the question I asked myself. Is there some reason why we can't have it? Why the community doesn't want it? So I looked in the docs. It's a good place to start. And I saw that the syntax for it was reserved when prototypes were added to the language. Alphanumeric, this is straight from the docs. Alphanumerics have been intentionally left out of prototypes for the express purpose of someday in the future adding named formal parameters in 95. Yeah. So, going back to the list, and this is my favorite thing to talk about. Well, that's not true. That's what I came here to talk about. I would love to talk about the core features, and I'll shut up now so I can get to that at the end. But this is the tricky part. Getting it through the code review, getting it to an acceptable state, making sure that I don't blow up the world trying to add this feature. So the 4 broad objections to when I started working on this is, number 1, if it was worth doing, it'd be done already. The core is too bloated. Future backwards compatibility. Yeah. Isn't that a fun one? It should be done on CPen first. Yeah. So, several times. If it was worth doing, it'd be done already. I don't even know how to argue with that one. I only started.
It's fallacy.
Yeah, exactly. You can't argue with illogic. So, just getting back to it, and this kind of touches on Rick's presentation. Worth it to whom? Well, we have Dave and Nick that get some money working on this, but for the most part, P5P is just volunteers. And if nobody wants to write a patch, it's not going to get written. If someone writes it, but it doesn't pique the interest of someone that can put it in the core, it's not going to go in. And the core committers, they have veto rights because obviously they know what's going to break or have a good sense of what's going to break, even if they haven't gone and looked at it. So you have to get past the gatekeepers, which is a good thing. But after enough time has passed, it hasn't gone in, and now next year we have the discussion all over again, and why isn't it in core already? So anyway, easy one. The core is too bloated already. The syntax for it was reserved, so it's not like we're adding something that wasn't expected. What did I just do? I hit the wrong key. Leave it to CPAN. The elephant in the room. And good. I actually gave this talk at work, and they had no idea why I put a picture of a moose in a slide about elephants. So, Moose does so many good things for us, but getting something like signatures is hard enough. If we talk about anything more than that, if we talk about all the fancy goodness that Moose gives us, we will absolutely get nowhere because it's too much of a change at once. So, getting back to the original bloated objection, 3 parts to it. Speed and space. Will it make it faster? Will it add too much overhead? Will it increase the footprint on disk? And that one I think doesn't get as much consideration as it should. Will it increase the footprint on disk? And this is an email that I remember from Perl 5 porters. Like I said, I read everything. This is from 2010, and I remembered it. It wasn't bookmarked. In a nutshell, Ubuntu is looking for space savings on their installation media, and using a minimal part of the Perl distribution happens to be an easy way of getting them. We want Perl everywhere. We want it to be in our Linux distros. I don't want to have to install it everywhere. I like that I can go on any Linux box, any Unix box, AIX, Solaris, and find Perl. And if we start making too many breakages or having it take too much space or whatever else, maybe they'll just go through and do the effort of porting things to something else. I don't want that to happen. That's just me, maybe. Maintenance overhead. This is the biggie. Of course, the Perl guts are a jungle of compile time switches, deeply nested macros, strict C89 compatibility, which isn't really that big a deal, and a custom tokenizer. So, SVPV, the macro to get the string portion from a scalar in XS. I blew up my screen. I am so sorry. I thought I saved this. Anyway, this would take up the entire slide. In 5.18 it doesn't. It's been trimmed down a bit, but it's still... That goes from that wall to that wall. So it really isn't any easier to read if it were jumbled into the screen like this. So these are huge hurdles for new developers who can take their time elsewhere. And if we don't make changes to the guts carefully, we can make it that much more difficult to bring on future developers. So if I put something in core to support signatures, and I make that macro take 40 lines instead of 38, the next guy behind me is going to have an even tougher time trying to figure out what I broke, if I broke anything. So, but if we don't make any changes at all, we really are at that dead end. And philosophical objections. So what we're working towards now is a minimal core, CPAN, and, well, what I like to work on, I think that's the general sense, is trying to bring more features into core, not to necessarily add the features themselves, but to make it easier for CPAN to do what it needs to do. So signatures. It is a beautiful feature. It is a wonderful thing. Moose uses it, method signatures. We have a bunch of other stuff that uses it. They do it in very difficult ways, and it's very hard to do. It doesn't have to be. Adding the features to the core to make it easier for those modules to work means that we can speed up development and add more fancy features and have more variety without having to break the core itself or get tied into backwards compatibility. And that's where the future backwards compatibility comes in. Future backwards compatibility means we're building stuff for the Perl core now. We're in a yearly cycle, so it's going to get released to production. You put it in now, it goes in next May. Maybe people will start using it right after that, hopefully. It'll start getting bundled in distros a little while after that. And it'll really start hitting a wide audience several years down the road. So by the time a feature is added now, before it hits broad distribution, we may even be out of the maintenance window. It may be 3 years down the road and we're not even officially supporting that version anymore. And we've already maybe made it not experimental anymore before it hits broad distribution. At that point, it's a backwards compatibility concern. So one of the concerns on the list I took most seriously was we have to make sure that it's done right the first time, because even if you don't realize it now, you will be supporting it forever. Or someone will. So the Perl defines the APIs for CPAN somewhat. And as long as those APIs keep their promises, CPAN works. And we hate to change the APIs for very good reasons. I am a fan of backwards compatibility. And if we change those, we break CPAN. And that's why I love backwards compatibility, because I love CPAN. And I want it to keep working. So if we add it, what happens if we decide that was a bad idea? We shouldn't have done it that way. Tough luck. See Smart Match. I think there's a long list we can come up with. So the other concern, who fixes it? So the person that puts it in, there's no guarantee that they can come back and fix it if it breaks later. Just because I wrote it doesn't mean that I own it. No guarantee that that person's even still going to be involved with the community when they find out that it's broken 2 years, 4 years, 6 years down the road. So there's very good reasons why committers may be very cautious about putting big things in the core. But that doesn't mean they're going to stop doing it. And getting back to Buddy's point, it should be done on CPAN first. It has. We've seen it. We know it. We have seen these modules and had them discussed right here. So there's a number of ways of doing these things and a number of modules doing it each way. And I mean, now I'm getting into the technicals. So, source filters. We have subsignatures. Perl 6 parameters, which is from the early 2000s, so I'm not sure if it even matches what Perl 6 looks like now. So we all know source filters. It does really evil stuff. It's basically rewriting your code out from under you, and that's all kinds of bad. Yeah. Only Perl can parse Perl. So if you have a source filter, you're... All right. Only Perl can parse Perl. That's one of the big reasons for that, and it might not be obvious to someone who hasn't looked at the core or really played around with the tokenizer, that, like prototypes, which I'll get back to, as you're parsing the language, it interacts with the current environment. So the parse does depend on the state. So for you to parse it properly, you have to know the proper state, which means that you have to have the proper engine tracking things, which means you have to be Perl, the language. Perl 5, Pumpkin Perl, whatever we want to call it. Subfilters are source filters are dangerous, and for a long time that was really the only way to do it anyway. So it worked, more or less, but we can't take something like that and just put it in core. So I like this one. This was more of a curiosity to me. So attribute handlers. There's a module on CPAN that does it like this. Subparameters. I guess that's a subsignature. It's a subsignature if you're used to Fortran. Which, whatever. But attributes are still experimental in 5.18. Not a good candidate. Nobody really wants it anyway, and it's dangerously implemented. So the modern method, devel declare, or devil declare. There's a bunch of them, and these are just the ones that I found with a quick search. So method signatures, signature simple, smooth sex method signatures, fun signatures. I don't even know all these. I just found them. They look like signatures, and looking through. So devil declare, for those who don't know, it installs subroutines called declarators, which basically take over parsing Perl for you at some point in the middle. So when you're running something that uses this, it takes over the parsing, and it will either do something like a source filtering and turn what you wrote into equivalent Perl and then stick that in the engine, or generate an op tree itself, which is really cool. I like playing around with that stuff, which is why I work in the core, because that's the only place you can do it safely. Because Perl doesn't make any promises about the ops. Why should you know about ops or care about ops or what the ops are doing? I'm writing Perl. I'm not writing Perl VM assembly. And it's dangerous because it can change out from under you. So, other things. If you're using Devil Declare, you can't do system-wide optimizations. You can change your own definition, but all you're doing is rewriting your own function in a more friendly way. So you can't affect the caller of your sub or the process of calling. You can't optimize what the VM is doing because the VM doesn't know you're doing it. And it does some black magic. That means we would never ever want Devil Declare as it is in the core. Devil Declare. Like the 32K file called stolen chunk of tok.c. I'm not even sure what version of Perl that was stolen from. I think it was originally from 5.8. I don't know how much is kept up, so I don't know what Unicode is going to do with this. So that was CPAN. So why would we want this in core? I kind of alluded at some of this before. So what we can do in core that CPAN can't. We can remove ops from the sub, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. We can allow B modules to deparse the signature. So if you're using something like method signatures and you run deparse, you see exactly what method signatures did for you, which is it rewrote as a sub, and it added some extra magic and some extra parameter validation. So you could have written the same thing yourself. It just looks a little more convoluted. And you also lose what the actual signature was. You see what the signature translates to. We get free core testing. So everything where the core runs, we would be testing with it automatically, which is awesome. If we break it, we'll find out immediately. And it becomes factory default. So there's still a lot of people that really can't distribute CPAN modules. I don't know how many there are. I have certain use cases where I don't want to use any more CPAN modules than I have to because it's a pain to distribute them. And for something that really should be out of the box, make it out of the box. So the plan. If it gets dual live, we can have one of those existing modules, refactored maybe, put it in core. It's on CPAN if you want the old version, and it's in core getting the testing and doing all of those neat optimization tricks under the hood with quick CPAN releases. So I'll come back to the bigger picture later on. So no more stolen chunk of tok.c. The feature doesn't impact performance if it's not used, which is a key constraint. You don't want to slow down the existing Perl. And for any of you who followed P5P, there is a branch on GitHub that has this. I tested it with Perl Bench, made very sure that adding the extra tokenizing doesn't blow things up, doesn't slow it down. It's unnoticeable unless you try to use it. So the challenges, prototypes, obviously. So we've had prototypes for 18 years now. Not in this room, but we may have had people at the conference that are younger than prototypes. And there's a lot of meaning on those few characters, and it really gets abused. They're very useful, but they get abused. So people sometimes use it for argument counts. That's about the only obvious reason for someone that doesn't know what they're doing. So I do this. It works. It doesn't do anything magic for me, but it works. Call it without the parens, it works just fine. Call it with one argument, with parens or without parens, and it dies, which is what I've seen people use the prototypes for. But there's ways around prototypes, so it's really not getting you anything if you really want to get around it. And we still have goto in the core, that's fine. It coerces types. This is the one that really bites people if they're not aware of it. It's not obvious that it's going to do this. So let's say we're starting a program with this. We have an args array with A, B, and C, and sub foo that just does, say, add underscore, and bar that has a prototype and does add underscore. So foo args prints ABC, foo with an anonymous array with the same, prints ABC. Bar prints 3, and bar with a QW prints C. I don't even know what's the right behavior for this. So I don't use prototypes.
That's the right behavior. Just dumb.
Yeah, thank you. And that's the pumpkin speaking. So it's very dangerous to use this. It's experts only, so it's useful when you need it, but it's dangerous in the hands of newbies. But we can't break it. We wouldn't want to break it because there are still places where it's useful. We don't want it to stop us, but we can't break it. We don't want to imply them either. I don't want to have two parameters attach a prototype because that'll cause even worse breakage. So how is it supposed to work? One of the very first discussions, and I think this actually derailed the original proposal, was do we still need @ if we use the signatures? For performance reasons, it'd be useful to not have this, to have a way to not have this, because that's an extra copy you don't need in each sub call, and sub calls are very expensive. That derailed us badly. If it's not set, what happens to things like ampersand foo calls that use the implied @_? They're just pulling things off the stack. If I got rid of the stack, I broke this. Or else I made some more monster spaghetti code to support this without having it gets messy. We don't want to do that. Is everything mandatory? Sometimes you want it mandatory, sometimes you don't. And this is Tim Towdy, so we don't want to force people to do it either way. If not, how do we distinguish foo undef and foo? That was really the sticking point with getting rid of that was a sticking point of @_. With @_, I can distinguish between two. Without it, I have to do black magic to try and fix it. So, how do we provide support for defaults? The constant case isn't bad, but when you start doing closures and lexicals and you get to things that are non-obvious, should parameters be copies or aliases? Now we're getting into the Perl 6 holy wars. So I'm Perl 5. I really haven't looked at Perl 6. So for me, copies makes a lot of sense. As my understanding, Perl 6 is more tending towards aliases, or some people just prefer aliases because it's, again, performance reasons. How does a sub with signatures behave if it's ampersand foo or go to foo? It's all the same thing. It's just now that we are trying to separate ourselves from the @_, we get to you have to work out the details on things like this and be clear what you're doing. And performance. So this is my favorite part of the whole thing because it can't slow down existing code. We don't want that, but sub-signatures should speed up new code. And this is what really pushed me onto the topic in the first place, because the more the interpreter knows, the more I promise the interpreter, the more the interpreter can do to help me out and make things faster. So if I promise I'm going to take these parameters and I want them to be copied and I make all these other statements ahead of time, then it can change how it compiles. It can change how the C-level stuff gets executed. And the last challenge was buy-in, but I think we got that one solved. It's just a matter of agreeing on names of APIs and such, which really isn't that big a deal. I hope. So the plan. I heard giggles. Add core support for signatures. Step 1. So this is the more technical stuff. A new type of magic to store the string representing the signatures. We don't want to use SVPV. Magic is better because prototypes use SVPV.
Could you use data structure, not magic?
It would really complicate things, and things are complicated enough already. But I'll get back to that. Using something auxiliary from where prototypes are stored means that the existing modules, like method signatures, can just attach to this and bring back the text string that represents the signature, instead of having it deep parse to the guts of what it's doing. And this goes into why we were talking about magic. I don't know how many people are familiar with it, and I don't want to read it, so TLDR. Storing the signature with magic is really simple to do in the core. It doesn't change any structures. It doesn't add any overhead. We do it in so many other places already, so it doesn't really complicate things. Adding functions to get and set that magic. That addresses the concerns. Best case is we don't expose the fact that it's magic. We expose functions instead of data structures to attach a signature. If we expose functions, then functions are a lot easier to change and maintain backwards compatibility than data structures. So I call set signature and get signature on a CV, and now I know what it's supposed to look like when I deparse it. Easy to maintain, or easier to maintain. A flag bit on the sub to control populating at underbar. So if someone doesn't want to use the def GV, then they can tell enter sub to skip it. So if you don't want the performance overhead, whatever it may be, you can turn it off. If you do want it, don't touch anything. We have flag bits for this. So, I mean, we have flag bits to spare, which we can use for this. Support for a per sub init function. What that means is you can add a callback. After the callback would be attached to the sub, it would run after you call it, after it's populated at underbar, but before it starts executing your own code. So if you want to do any kind of fancy magic, fancy validation, you can do it in C, or you can do it in attached Perl if you want, with just attaching a C-level callback. It's similar to how the debugger works, but we don't want to conflate the two because they do different things, and conflating things is how we end up with 40-line macros. Only one callback at a time, so it's just insanity to have two different method signatures, functions loaded at once. You don't know what you're going to get, and they would blow each other up badly. An API to register a parser, same reason. Data structures we want to be able to change. Functions are a lot easier to maintain than data structures. And this gets back to the example I had with a single quoted closing parens inside of a signature. A signature is a mini language, and that is so key to think about at the start of this, because that means that it needs to be parsed, and it needs to be parsed separately. It may have its own rules. It can decide what its own rules are. So the is keyword, using an attribute, those things are really separate from how everything outside of the signature gets parsed. And you do need to enforce that demarcation and allow for something else to do the parsing itself. And yeah, being able to register that parser means we don't have to tie all this details directly into the opcodes and make it really horrible to maintain. Which means no less core maintenance burden, and everybody wins. Yay! Step 2, add a new module to core. So to turn these things on and off, we really want a namespace. The namespace that's obvious is signatures, which is already a module on CPAN. But fortunately, the signatures module works exactly like what a minimal signatures should do, I think. So, dual life. Except get rid of the devil declare and all the other CPAN magic that it's doing, because we're in core. When we're in core, we can take advantage of the core features and make sure that those features are good and useful to everybody else. If we break it, we can make another module, signatures 520, and you can use v5.20 and get signatures 5.20 functionality. So for a default that's in core, making copies is definitely the safer way to go. And a prototype attribute. If you have a prototype attribute, when you add a sub with a signature, we get both. We get prototype support. It works just the same way it does now, and we get signatures. So that's what the signatures modules does already, and it seems to work out well for them. So take it, steal it. So as far as defaults, if we call it with too few arguments, set it to undef. At underbar is not touched, so we can still check to see if too few were passed. It just seems like the Perlish thing to do for me. We don't force it unless they want it to be forced. Too many arguments is an error. I haven't really talked this through. I don't remember if this was discussed on the list, but if you want extra arguments, you can add an adjunct. It's having too many arguments go through. I can't think of a good reason for that. I can think of a good reason for default to undef. I can't think of a good reason why you'd want to allow extra arguments. So feel free to yell at me. It's not in core yet.
JavaScript is okay with it. You can pass more arguments than you have any parameters.
It's not an argument for or against.
So it's really, that is an easy thing to work around, to change. We've got till next May, hopefully. Ampersand foo, it's already just mostly foo add underbar. So since we're not touching the add underbar, this doesn't change, it just works. Yay. Move the signatures API. Right now, the signatures module has an API. It exposes its guts so anybody else can use it. We can't expose those guts because that depends on devil declare. So make it a separate module. If you try and load signatures in 5.16, it'll use signatures API. Step 3, smoke cpan. Make sure we didn't break anything. That should be an obvious step, but I wanted to make very clear that smoking cpan and smoking Perl are the key parts of this. We don't want to break anything. And step 5, profit, obviously. So, questions? Yes?
First a statement, yay.
Yay.
Secondly, I regularly use, I don't code in Perl 5 anymore without using one of the method signatures interfaces. That's just my way. But the method part and setting self is also something that I really depend on. I do not expect the first patch to solve it,
Yes.
but I would like to know how you envision it being solved.
Actually, I've been talking to, excuse me, if you don't mind, which methods or which modules do you use?
I started with method signatures.
Okay.
I ended up with some compatibility problems. It was especially hard to debug because I was using Toro at the time, and so the core dumps were even more interesting. Parse errors turned into core dumps was the problem. So I switched to method signatures simple, which is essentially sugar around an array assignment, and as such has been easy for me to adapt to.
So my specific goal, well, short answer for the microphone, method signatures had some compatibility issues, so method signature simple. I specifically want to not just get something in core, not put an API in there and throw it in a Perl in a Delta and say, yeah, use it if you want. I want to go through this list of modules that I made, and if it was incomplete, add more and say, let me know what you think. Do these APIs work for you? What else do you need? So an implicit shift of $self is absolutely something we would want in the future. Adding support for it in the core right now is absolutely something we want right now. So that's part of what the whole callback was for. So having a callback after the sub is called, after @_ is populated, after we have everything locally available, you can do things in C to put it in the right pad variables.
Oh, I wasn't clear on that. I thought that the callback was going to be a CD itself. You make a C callback?
Yes, a C callback. So the trick is, well, C callback makes the most sense to me because we're in a really dangerous spot in the stack. So
Well, for performance, I
Yeah.
think it's even more.
yes,
But
yeah. So, well, for performance and being able to also call an external, to call an actual CV would be very useful. But considering we're kind of in the middle of a transition between one sub to another, I imagine that could cause all kinds of really dangerous breakages.
Well, in order to implement interesting defaults, I think you need to be at a place where you can at least call another subroutine anyway. So it's possible that it will be doable, that the C function could call a CV. But I agree with you, we shouldn't guarantee it yet.
Yes. So, did you have a question?
Why are there no tests and no documentation in your module?
Oh.
I didn't even have a module on the screens. What do you mean?
Because we didn't contribute them yet.
It's.
There you go. Volunteer.
I came to the conference and got some round to it to get back to work on this.
And there's even a name clash with an existing module with the same name, which has more features and has documentation tests. So it's a
That's actually the point. He was mentioning the name clash with signatures, and I've been reaching out to the signatures guys because if you're using the signatures module, you're either using it for the default sugar it gives you from a pure Perl perspective, or you're using it for the API. So if we split out the functionality and say the signatures double-colon API module is still on CPAN, it's still available, you can use all the devil declare methods and support that kind of extensibility. But if you just use signatures, you'll get the same syntax you got from CPAN and the same tests from CPAN, and I'm going through their bugs to make sure that I don't step on the same bugs that they've hit due to some of the double declare limitations. Then we'll get in a better place. So feel free to break it as hard as you can. Tell me everything that you can find wrong with it. I mean, you contributed to the discussion very early on, and I really appreciate it, because I want to make sure we break this early. Break it early, break it often, make sure it's really robust.
You should at least add more documentation, because you support also hashes and arrays at the end, but you don't document it. But you error on it, so it's super simplistic.
Yes.
Overly simplistic.
He's volunteering so many things.
Yes, there will be documentation. So there will be documentation in core. I will put out blog posts. I have my yes, and lots of tests, which serve as good documentation too. So, any other questions? Yes.
The API that you have in place to extend the parsing, is there a precedent for that, and/or would something like that be something to add in more places to make something like develop declare less hacky?
Yes, there's various precedents for it actually, conflicting precedents. And that's kind of the issue. So I've gone through and I'm still looking at it. The API isn't finalized. Nick Clark and Dave Mitchell Nick Clark mostly has given me a lot of good advice on this, and I plan to come back and bug him when I have more code that's in good enough shape to waste his time on. But yes, attributes has some kind of extensibility like this. That's why they used that before. That API is really not appropriate for this. Being able to add keywords to the language, that's part of what Devil Declare does, and Devil Declare is, to a certain extent, just adding pure Perl wrapping around the kinds of keywords or keyword support that was added in core. But it gets to be tricky, and the big thing is making sure that things get added through functions instead of data structures. The more we add data structures, the more we're tied to particular implementation details. Functions are much more, we can change the guts a lot more. Yes?
Early on you were talking about dropping @_ and having like a bit to turn it on or off if you're using that prototype. But then later you're talking using @_ to like validate kind of arguments. So I was curious, is that still the plan to have the bit turned off? It's just by default still there? Or I missed something somewhere?
No. That's why I was talking about how difficult it would be to call a CV directly. Because at the point where a flag bit could turn off populating @_, which in the core is defgv, we have the information available. It's just controlling whether it gets copied from one location to another. So if we don't copy it, anything that's using a callback still has access to the original versions. So it's still there to be used by extra modules. It just means that the language itself, the Perl 5 code that you write, won't see it. And that has knock-on effects that you have to be careful of and really promise that I know what I'm doing when I do this. Yes?
@_ is initialized without copying. So I wonder why anyone would complain to you about the performance issues of it. Has anyone made themselves clear on that?
Like I said, that's what derailed us at one point before. It doesn't seem like it should be that much of a big deal, because it's copying pointers. It's not copying data structures. So it's really.
But no, what I'm trying to say is it isn't even doing that. If you look, @_ is set up to just have a pointer into the stack. That's all it is. It doesn't even copy the pointers. It doesn't. There's an operation called reify that can be done to it to make it copy the pointers. That is only ever invoked if you modify the shape of that underscore. For example, if you shift or push it. But if you never do that, no copying even of pointers is taking place. The performance issues seem to me to be negligible.
Yeah.
And
I'm
not, believe me, I know that you know this. It's just, I want everyone to understand the nature of the question, which is,
Yes.
because this is true, well, why were there complaints?
I'm sorry, and I'll come back to this. The original suggestion was really just a future backward compatibility concern, saying if we add signatures to the language now, if we defer a decision on having the add underscore, and that's as much from a syntax level as from a performance level, then we're tied to it.
Oh,
So it was kind of an experimental feature, and a flag bit means that I'm giving you the gun, you can shoot yourself in the foot if you want to.
so yeah, so it was essentially a back compat issue, and we didn't have enough experience to know exactly what the consequences would be.
Yes.
Makes sense? Thank you.
It was a different point also. We lose some feature because the new default would be copying. And with the old underscore direct access, so we would have refs, and we don't have, we didn't define syntax for the refs.
Yes.
Or is alias, basically. So something like a backslash or something.
However,
But we still have the underscore, so we have
however,
it.
if it's an error to pass too many parameters, then the additional parameter that you supposedly would want to access through add underscore would not be available because the function call would fail. Which means that if you intend to do that, you would not be using these features anyway.
Yep.
So, anyway, I don't want to derail the conference meeting. I'm sorry.
It's useful, thank you.
I'm simply seeking clarification. Thank you.
Yes. And it's very useful. I like that we can have this kind of discussion in person. Yes.
Yes, I want to clarify something. I have a lot of code where if the user does not give me enough parameters, I die with the helpful message, I expect blah. How will I do that if I want to use signatures for the performance, but I still want to provide useful error messages?
Yes.
I actually have a ton of tests that make sure that the message is correct.
Okay. I've been bad about repeating questions for the microphone, but that one is very important. If we make it die, what is the error message? And can I override the error message? So, with a callback, absolutely. So really, my whole intent is not to provide a golden solution. It's to provide a good model. So it can be forked, cloned, and make your own variation that changes the error messages or localizes the error messages if you want to.
And probably the work on separating the API in the core from the implementation itself should enable that to some degree.
Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
So, how do you envision those of us that want to keep these modules alive that do more than just the basic? I mean, I agree with your approach that you should start simple and then add stuff later once that's come to be accepted. But in the meantime, how do you envision? Do you think we would still be using double declare, or and then generating the new syntax instead of?
So the question was, going forward and doing this methodology, would other modules like method signatures still be using double declare, or what would the plan be with that? The whole intent is to provide helper methods for you. So the helper methods we can put in can be we have a bit more freedom as far as backwards compatibility on helper methods at the XS level than we do for syntax changes. So having something in core that's just minimal syntax for signatures, but having some powerful APIs means that whatever you need to get off devil declare, we can figure out how to get that in core. So the callback is the easy one because it's a callback. You can do whatever you want if you do it in C.
But the callback is, like you said, would happen at the point in the sub after which add underscore set up, but before the code starts executing. But you also have to have some way to get the syntax parsed, right? Because there's extensions to the syntax.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Did I skip that part? Yes, a signature parser. The point of mentioning the mini language was because we need to have a custom signature parser. So I'm not sure what the best way to do that is. The trick is really quoted strings. Figuring out what's a quoted string, because typically you want to use the quoted strings that Perl has, and that gets kind of hairy sometimes. And that's, I think, what default declared gives you. It helps you, it does a lot of the parsing. Well, yes.
It is probably quite possible to leverage Perl's existing grammar here. After all, there's a sub-language inside strings, so when you say $A arrow open curly, it has to drop back to the full language to parse the subscript, right? So you should be able to do that too.
Yes, and
That should make it better than what we're doing. I mean, what a lot of the deviled declared people do, what we do certainly, is to use PPI, which is close, but close. Not
Yeah.
exactly.
And one of the big features of some of the recent regular expression work, not the 518 work, but several versions back, was making sure that the engine is reentrant, because all the double question mark stuff in the regular expression goes back into the parser, and we don't want to leak that stuff. So we can absolutely take advantage of the work that Dave Mitchell has done there in the past and in the recent versions, with more of a focus on making sure that it doesn't break your stuff too, without adding too many new APIs. So this is not a dead end. This is just the beginning.
The beginning of smart city.
Thank you.